So we're living through truly trying times for the Iranian people, with nearly half the US Navy mobilized to enter the Persian Gulf. I want to zoom out and talk about what led us here, what happened on January 8th and 9th, the narrative framework and meaning assigned to events, and my experience as an anti-war, anti-sanctions Iranian Canadian. Narrative framings designed for Western consumption by imperialists or imperialism-aligned Iranian diaspora groups have made it difficult for Canadians to clearly speak out against the coming, or we could argue, ongoing war. I will discuss how we should respond as anti-war Canadians, but first I will tell you how anti-war, anti-sanctions positions are handled in this country. On January 15th of this year, I represented the Iranian Canadian Congress on CBC Power and Politics. In this interview with David Cochrane, I summarized the order of events in Iran with information available at that time, that Iran does not exist in a vacuum, that sanctions are deliberate economic warfare to stoke unrest, and that people's legitimate grievances were co-opted by external forces into something destructive. I cited published information, including Israeli sources and former US Attorney General Mike Pompeo, telling Iranians that Mossad was walking alongside them in the streets. Following my interview, ICC's socials were inundated with defamatory and threatening comments by monarchists. I'm sure you've all seen the slogans by now. My employer was spammed with emails calling to fire me. The CBC also received many messages of concern, arguing that my statements did not align with Iranian Canadians' views. In response, the next week, Power and Politics hosted a pro-regime change Iranian Canadian and former ICC president, a fact they did not disclose, of course, in the pursuit of so-called balance. David Cochrane apologized no less than 4 times for hosting me, saying he was expecting a different story, much like the one he was hearing tonight. Amid the backlash, I received messages from an individual critiquing me for allegedly discounting Iranians' agency. This person first claimed that there was no evidence for the statements I had made regarding Mossad activity in Iran, and then backtracked, arguing, since when have they told the truth? Given Israel's history with Iran, their public statements, Farsi language and cultural education programs, and their known intelligence capabilities, there is no doubt that Mossad has operatives in Iran. The fact that some deny this, claiming my interview was all lies, reveals something about their psychological state. This is too inconvenient of a truth for them to admit. Even assuming, for argument's sake, that Israeli and American sources are lying, and that the violence and sabotage of January 8th and 9th was accomplished by independent grassroots actors, the claims of the likes of Mike Pompeo and Reza Pahlavi that Mossad and the US would support the protesters and encouraging them to take to the streets at no personal risk to the armchair generals, but at immense risk to the people on the ground, puts at least some of the blame for the deadly outcome on these foreign actors. But there are people who want regime change so badly that they're willing to ignore not only Israeli atrocities in Iran, but also the genocide in Palestine, which the Iranian government has materially resisted. I spoke to an older relative of Iran in Iran a few weeks ago, and he described the violent protesters as dolls, unaware of who controlled them. He lamented that many were pardoned after the 2022 protests and were once again causing trouble. We must remember that 1979 was an anti-imperialist revolution, throwing off the yoke of the Shah installed by the US and Britain in a coup of democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh following his nationalization of Iran's oil. That revolution and the government it formed reflects a people's decision to stand up and chart their own sovereign development path. With this in mind, had January 8th and 9th succeeded, that would be a regression. When we see what appears to have been highly trained actors and youth led down a dark path, causing chaos aimed at maximizing death and destruction, the only agency to speak of appears intended to stoke civil war, foreign intervention, and balkanization, all of which would be devastating to Iranians, including workers and marginalized groups. When these acts are encouraged by foreign governments, abusing people's sentiments and treating them as disposable pawns, we should question how far agency applies as a concept. But let's discuss some of the potentially disadvantaged groups in Iran before I move on to the framings of the events that Western audiences are seeing and draw some conclusions. So who is oppressed in Iran? Certainly not women, at least not the urban middle class, who have some of the highest education rates in the world, are active in all fields, and are highly mobile, many of whom, along with men of the same socioeconomic status, emigrate out of Iran. The changes in recent years, for example, the number of Iranian women in public without hijab, are a testament to the power of their activism and Iranians continuing to chart their own path. Iran also recognizes trans people officially, but this is within the framework of a strict gender binary, which excludes individuals who are gender nonconforming or non-heteronormative. So within these groups, tensions arise with individuals asserting personal freedoms against the state. And some might find the liberal ideas and discourse in the West more appealing than what is perhaps a very long road of fighting for their rights within the confines of the Iranian legal system. So they tend to leave Iran as refugees. This leads to a necessity to emphasize potential harm that would come to them in Iran, which Western media then exploits. In turn, the emigration of these groups and their intersection with the mobile upper class makes for a skew in the diaspora that is not to be discounted when considering whether diaspora groups are representative of Iranians. Spoiler, they're not. The protests started on December 28th among Iranian bazaris, small business owners, in response to the collapse of the Iranian rial due to currency manipulation, which meant they would be selling their goods at a loss. Inflation has been an issue in Iran for years, due in large part to sanctions, which of course affect all societal strata. So it's not surprising that various workers' groups, unions, and opposition parties also joined this movement to push for progressive change, like wage increases, and make broader statements asking for systemic changes in governance. Are there internal contradictions in Iran as a capitalist society that the government should handle differently? Of course. But this too was stoked by outside forces. This was perhaps best exemplified by U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who admitted on February 16th that the goal was to create a dollar shortage in the country. And then when the Iranian currency went into free fall, inflation exploded, and hence we've seen the Iranian people out in the street. Another oft-cited issue in Iran is economic corruption. My conversations with Iranians indicate corruption is real, but that has less to do with the Islamic Republic per se than with material conditions. The economic structure is capitalist, a system that fundamentally depends on the exploitation of workers by paying them less than the surplus value generated by their labor. Modern Iran has undergone much economic development, and in doing so has appointed economists educated in the Milton Friedman's Chicago School, which has led today to neoliberal policies that put a squeeze on ordinary people, much like we see in the West. But even in this context, the Islamic Republic maintains free higher education and subsidizes food and gas, offsetting some of the effects of sanctions. If we want relief for ordinary people, we must end the decades-long Western sanctions. Speaking of economic development, on my last trip to Iran in the winter of 2022 to 2023, I was taken to the new Tehran Mall by my cousin and his wife. It was a huge building that my cousin expected to impress me with some beautiful architectural components, poster ads of women without hijab, and many shops selling a variety of goods. I asked my host if they shop there. They did not. It was too expensive. I have since heard criticism of the wealthy owner of this mall, but my cousin's position was not critical, but he was concerned with limited economic mobility. It was possible to make a living, but not to climb the socioeconomic ladder. What does this indicate? The Iranian middle class is experiencing a squeeze while maintaining aspirations of class mobility. I also asked my cousin about his understanding of the women life freedom protests that occurred months before my visit. He flipped the question on me. What did I understand from my 2-week stay? I suggested that people seemed more concerned with putting bread on the table than with hijab laws, and weren't necessarily preoccupied with the need for regime change. And he agreed. So the middle class and workers are under pressure from both internal contradictions and outside interference in the form of sanctions. But we need to discuss the truly disenfranchised, what Fanon called the wretched of the earth, and the 1979 Iranian revolutionaries, including Khomeini, referred to as the mustazafin, whom they had a duty to protect. A comrade recently suggested to me that it is important to center them in discussions like this. And And I'd like to take that advice and then discuss what happens when a group of people feel so unheard by their own government that they are inclined to appeal to outside forces, and come back to my thoughts on the limitation of so-called respecting people's agency. The economic development of Iran has led to major urbanization since the revolution, leaving some people behind from the south of Tehran and its outskirts and from border towns that have been historically underdeveloped. I have a zine from the 2022 protests that describes the harrowing life circumstances of a handful of Iranian anarchists and their actions. Most were from border towns, most were poor, and had drug addict parents who abused them. Many suffered sexual abuse by a parent or by others. The plight of these young people could be interpreted as a failure of the state. Iran has modern harm reduction programs, but drugs, particularly opiates, are a problem, certainly not helped by the fact that opium production, which was ironically banned by the Taliban, was not controlled after the US invasion of Afghanistan. So some people have fallen through the cracks of the system, and these youth had immense amount of justifiable anger and found solace in anti-government beliefs, which justified directing that anger outward. But their narratives lacked a deeper theoretical foundation or planning that could lead to real progress. I don't fault them for it, but this also renders them vulnerable to exploitation by forces that may wish to direct the youth's anger to their own ends. Iranian border regions in the west of the country coincide with Kurdish territory in the east and with other tribal and in the east with other tribal groups such as the Baluch, with their own community structures, sometimes expressing separatist sentiments. Some separatist groups form known strategic affiliations with the US, but as we've seen with Rojava, those alliances are fragile when the superpower shifts priorities. Rojava is no longer independent and has been integrated into the Syrian state ruled by al-Qaeda terrorist al-Jawlani. It is unclear what the future holds for Syria, especially now with the release of so many ISIS inmates, but it seems that a strong nation is needed to avoid falling to the whims of imperialist forces. Like many Iranians, I hope Iran does not suffer the same fate. The protests of late December to January have set in motion a domino effect whose ultimate end, if the chain is not broken, is a world war that will send ripples of change through the global economy, but not without first raining untold death and destruction on the peoples of West Asia and globally. In Western countries, we saw much of the Iranian diaspora rally behind Pahlavi. Those who have been paying attention over the last 2+ years will note that the same flags we saw speckled throughout Zionist protests are now showing up at American embassies in cities throughout Canada, begging Trump to bomb Iran. They celebrate the burning of mosques in Iran, attack Islamic centers in Canada, force Iranian-owned businesses to display their flag, and leverage social media to send disturbing threats to anyone who dares disagree with them. This is a fascistic movement that has little to do with the grievances of Iranians. Some online campaigns have instead suggested Pahlavi as a leader of a democratic transition. But Pahlavi is so unpopular in Iran that even Trump has opted out of backing him. Pahlavi is friendly with Israel, who wants to fully disarm Iran, a dangerous proposition that will allow Israel to pursue its expansionist policies unabated. But what about the narratives around Iranian protests constructed for Western consumption that focus on liberal democratic or even radical liberal narratives that appeal to Western secular ideals of individual freedom, human rights, and agency? The ones that say to listen to Iranian voices, sometimes even to be our voice, something I find pretty offensive, actually. What is left unsaid in these narratives? And what does it mean to have solidarity with Iran and Iranian people in these times? I think about the overrepresentation of LGBTQ+ folks at pro-Palestine protests. Queer Arabs and Muslims are at the forefront of these actions, having confronted the contradictions and understood that stopping the genocide of their peers in Palestine is prerequisite to the fight for other freedoms among their more conservative brethren. Without stopping war and destruction of Iranian civilian infrastructure and the likely balkanization that would ensue, we will not see progress in Iranians' aspirations towards greater workers' rights, gender equality, sexual and reproductive rights, and so on. The strain of activism that is blind to foreign meddling is simply too inconvenient a truth to be discussed. It's irresponsible and dangerous. How is it that we went from talking about the Iranian state's treatment of protesters to discussing its nuclear capabilities and missile program? Other projects are afoot, and we need to pay attention. And in paying attention, we need to pierce the fog that would have us throw up our hands in defeat, saying it's complicated. Opposing war on Iran means opposing sanctions designed to immiserate working Iranians. It means standing up to our Canadian leadership, like Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand, who stated last week that we will not open diplomatic relationships with Iran unless there's a regime change, period. Meanwhile, announcing new sanctions. I cannot vote in Iranian elections because Canada does not have consular services with the country of my birth. Such is the irony of our present moment. The only option given in Canada by our government, by our media, and by a significant contingent of the diaspora is to bomb Iran, not to participate in its democracy. How's that for so-called democratic values? We can do better. And thank you for your time.